Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that literally touches every single aspect of our lives, often without us even realizing it. We're going to untangle the biological realities of sex from the deeply ingrained societal constructs of gender. We hear these terms used interchangeably all the time, right? But as we're going to see through our source material today, they actually represent two completely different worlds. One is firmly rooted in our DNA, and the other is built entirely by the cultures we live in. It's like looking at society through a completely new lens. Let's get started.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to take a peeling the onion approach. We'll hit 1, defining sex versus gender, then 2, the societal construction, 3, types of gender roles, 4, the socialization process, 5, Kohlberg's developmental stages, and wrap up with 6, building an equitable society.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, defining sex versus gender.
Okay, let's dive right into this. If we want to understand complex societal structures, we absolutely have to start with a rock-solid foundation. Let's look at sex first. We're talking strictly biology and genetics here. It's a physiological reality, determined by anatomy, reproductive organs, your underlying DNA. So when we say male, female, or intersex, we're talking science, we're talking sex. Gender, on the other hand, entirely different ballpark. Gender isn't something you can just put under a microscope. It's a socio-cultural system. A whole web of meanings, expectations, and roles that society artificially pastes onto your biological sex. That's where terms like masculine and feminine come in.
When you put them side by side like this, the differences are just glaring. Take their origins. Sex is pure, natural biology. Gender is a man-made social construct. And because of that, their constancy is totally different too. Biological sex is constant. A biological male in ancient Rome is genetically the exact same as a biological male living today. But gender? No way. What was considered peak masculinity in 18th century France looks wildly different from what's considered masculine in modern-day Tokyo. It is so fluid. Even with something like maternity. Giving birth is a biological phenomenon tied to sex, right? But the social care, the nurturing attitudes, the expectations placed on mothers, that whole shebang is tied to gender. Basically, sex is in your chromosomes, so it's generally unchangeable. Gender is a social script, meaning it's highly fluid.
Moving on to Section 2. The societal construction.
So if there's this clear boundary between nature and culture, how does society actually build these fluid roles? Well, that brings us to Simone de Beauvoir's famous 1949 book, The Second Sex. She wrote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." It's a massive idea. She's pointing out that femininity itself is a social product. Sure, you might be born with a biologically female body, that's the sex we just talked about, but then that body is heavily regulated by societal norms. Society takes that raw biology and forces it into a cultural performance. You literally become the gendered expectation through a lifetime of conditioning, slowly learning to behave, dress, and speak in ways deemed acceptable by the culture around you.
Let's unpack that further in Section 3, types of gender roles. If we are performing these roles, what's the script we're actually following? Let's map out how these roles have historically evolved. We usually start with the traditional role. Think strict, rigid division of labor based entirely on biological sex. Man as the breadwinner, woman as the primary caregiver. Period. Then, as cultures shift, we enter a transitional phase. The man is still culturally the primary breadwinner, but women are, permitted to work outside the home. It loosens the rules a bit, but the expectations are still pretty skewed, often leaving women juggling a job and all the domestic work. Finally, we get to the egalitarian role. This is where domestic duties and economic contributions are shared equally. The real game changer here is that there are absolutely no sex-based roles. Your biology doesn't arbitrarily dictate who earns the paycheck or who does the laundry.
Which brings us to Section 4, the socialization process.
We aren't born automatically knowing what traditional or egalitarian means, right? So how does it get wired into our brains? Think about your own upbringing for a second. How did you learn what was expected of you based on whether you were labeled a boy or a girl? What toys were handed to you? What colors did you wear? Who gave you those cues? It's not magic. It happens through a highly structured, pervasive process.
So the crucial point here is that gender socialization is driven by 4 main agents of learning, and they work around the clock through constant imitation and reinforcement. When a kid imitates a gender-appropriate behavior, they get rewarded. When they don't, they get corrected. First up is family. That's your primary source of identity. It's where you first see how chores are divided, where you get praised for being tough or sweet. Then, schools. Think peer pressure, formal dress codes, separate sports teams. Third is media. TV, movies, social media. They are constantly feeding us these ideal representations of masculinity and femininity. They tell us what heroes and beauty are supposed to look like. And finally, peers. Your friends give you massive social validation. If you step outside the norm, peers are usually the very first to police you, whether through teasing or exclusion. Together, these four agents completely teach us the performance of gender.
Next up, Section 5, Kohlberg's developmental stages.
But how does a child's developing brain actually process all that input from family and media? This is where Lawrence Kohlberg's 1966 cognitive development theory comes in, and it's fascinating. It gives us the exact psychological timeline of how a child internalizes gender. Between ages 2 and 3, they develop gender identity. They can point to themselves and say, I'm a boy or I'm a girl, but it's based entirely on superficial stuff like hair length or clothes. Then, around ages 4 to 5, the brain matures and hits gender stability. They realize gender stays the same over time. A boy becomes a man, a girl becomes a woman. But the final puzzle piece doesn't click until ages 6 to 7. Kohlberg calls this gender constancy. This is the massive cognitive leap where a child realizes their gender is totally stable even if their outward appearance changes. A boy realizes he's still a boy even if he plays with a doll or puts on a dress. So gender is actively constructed and solidified in the child's mind as they systematically try to make sense of the world.
Finally, Section 6, Building an Equitable Society.
We've traced this all the way from our fundamental biology up to societal structures and down into childhood psychology. And the conclusion drawn by the source material is incredibly powerful. Because gender is a social construct, because it's man-made and taught through socialization, it's not an unchangeable law of nature. It can be changed. By clearly understanding the line between fixed biological sex and fluid social gender, we actually unlock the power to rewrite the script. We aren't trapped by traditional roles if they don't serve us anymore. The source argues that grasping this exact distinction is how we move toward a more democratic, equitable society where a person's opportunities aren't arbitrarily limited by their biology.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Everything we've covered today proves that society made the rules of gender. And society is just you and me, which means we can change them. If gender is indeed a changeable construct, how will you use this understanding in your own life? How can recognizing the massive difference between biological reality and cultural performance help us strip away biases and build a world that's truly equitable for everyone? Keep questioning the world around you, and thanks for joining me on The Explainer today. I'll see you next time.